Welcome to the Green Urbanist, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. If this is your first time here, if you're fairly new to the podcast, welcome. This podcast is all about how architects, planners, designers, policymakers, ecologists, anyone who lives and works in cities, how they can make cities more sustainable, healthier, happier, adapt to climate change. That's basically it in a nutshell. This episode is an interview. It's a conversation with a guy called James Godfrey-Faussett. I get so much out of interviewing people on this podcast, and in particular I love talking to people who are out there getting their hands dirty and actually, doing things to make a difference, and that definitely applies to today's guest, James. James creates urban forests. He operates under the name Wild Urban Spaces, and he also works with a rewilding organization called SUGi, SUGi. You can find links to his work and ways to contact him in the description. In particular, as well as going out there and planting forests in urban areas, James is an expert in what's called the Miyawaki Method of afforestation, which is a very particular method of rapidly creating healthy, native, and vibrant forest ecosystems, which can be applied to relatively small spaces and is really good for use in cities. Now, we talk about that in detail during the podcast, so I won't give too much away. It's a fantastic episode. I learned so much from James. Just to say, if you're enjoying the podcast, you feel like you're getting value out of it, one thing you can do there's a few things you can do to show your appreciation. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give me a 5-star review and write a quick review. Doesn't even have to be very long. You can just say nice, good, 5 stars. Getting reviews actually helps the podcast get more coverage, more visibility on the platform, and therefore get more people listening. Wherever you're listening, subscribe, make sure you don't miss any future episodes. And you can also follow the podcast on social media. It is on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So whatever platform you're using, just search for Green Urbanist Podcast and it should pop right up. And I absolutely love hearing from people who are listening, whether you have any feedback, positive or negative. If you want to tell me what future topics you'd like to hear on the podcast, or if you just want to say hello and connect, please do so. It's one of the best things of doing this podcast is growing my sort of community and getting to know people who are, in a similar mindset and trying to do good things in cities as well. So please do that. Okay, without further ado, here is my interview with James. Welcome, James, to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Ross. Nice to be with you. Thank you.
Great. I mean, the first question I have to ask you is, when you're at a party or you meet someone for the first time and they ask you the question, so what do you do? What do you say?
It's a really funny question, actually, because I've been kind of involved in landscape gardening, garden design for about 25 years. So I've had to change, actually. So now I actually say I create urban forests.
Amazing.
And that's as near as I can get to what I do, really.
Yeah. Well, we need to ask you about your story then. How did you get there? And how can I create urban forests when I grow up, basically?
As I said, my background's kind of landscaping, garden design. I always try to incorporate organic methods, biodynamic methods, I've never really used any form of chemicals. And they just evolved into trying to find a way that I could help the environment more, to kind of give back more, particularly when I had young kids. But I could never really find the right type of thing. I think, like yourself, I love trees, I love forests. I kind of dreamt of the idea of creating forests, but it sort of seemed unrealistic. And then literally one day I was watching a documentary called Call of the Forest, which is fantastic, which I recommend to everybody. And within this, it featured the Miyawaki Method and Akira Miyawaki. And suddenly, there was like a light bulb came on that actually this was a solution that we could kind of bring into our everyday lives and into urban areas. And it really went from there. And I did my research and I kind of literally switched. So I went from landscaping into creating urban forests using the Miyawaki Method. And I've never looked back really, because for me, the great thing is it is a solution. You know, there's so many ideas out there, potential ideas, but this is actually a proven solution for urban greening and biodiversity and everything.
So what is the Miyawaki Method? How does that work?
Sure. Well, I mean, like very quickly, the background of it is, I just mentioned, was it was kind of invented. If you can invent nature, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you can invent nature.
Reinvent, maybe.
Yeah. Well, exactly. He is a botanist, a Japanese botanist, an ecologist. He's about 80. I think he's about 86 years old now. He's still going. He says he's going to keep planting for the next 30 years as well, which is great. But he basically came up with this method, and it's an extraordinary method of afforestation. But what's amazing about it is it just mimics nature. I mean, he went out and he studied nature. He wanted to find a way of rapidly getting native forest back into areas, and particularly into urban areas, where they would grow very quickly, be very self-sustaining. And he kind of like studied shrines where trees had been left alone for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and noticed that, you know, it was always the proper indigenous trees of that area that had survived, that were doing well. And he basically took this on, and he developed it into the method. And it's really following the laws of the forest. So it's really trying to create small forests as quickly as possible, that establish as quickly as possible, that are maintenance free, using basically this methodology that he created.
Okay, fascinating. And what's involved in it? Do you have to use? You said it's all organic and everything, so it's not like you're pumping it full of fertilizer to make it grow quicker or anything. No,
not at all. No, the kind of first thing we do is a potential natural vegetation selection, which is really finding what native trees would have grown where we are. Essentially, if we all disappeared off the planet, what would grow where we live in 600 years' time? It's those trees that were here sort of when the last ice age finished. And we're looking really to identify those. And we do it by kind of going out within a sort of 20-mile radius of each project, trying to identify the native trees. And we've got about 60 native trees, native species in the UK. So we're not that many. And basically trying to identify which ones of those within a 20-mile radius are growing and growing healthily. And then we kind of take those and we look at the different heights, because the key thing is we're looking at canopy height. So we want like a fantastic mix of canopy heights. So we have a really dense canopy, and we turn that into a list. The second stage is we do an awful lot of work on the soil. We don't just kind of, and this is kind of where people sort of get a bit bamboozled by it, because we kind of just put so much work into the soil, because all we're trying to do is create like a forest soil. So rather than just digging a hole, sticking a few trees in, we actually want to create the right kind of fungal networks, the right type of biology in the soil, so that it works and basically keeps the soil healthy itself and feeds the trees. So this is quite a big part of it. So we'll do a soil analysis. We'll add what's missing. We'll add the ancient strains of fungi back into the soil. And then the next stage really is planting. So we plant really densely. We plant 3 or 4 saplings per square meter.
Oh, right, okay.
Which is kind of like, again, people can't, it's a kind of a hard point to get across, because people are so used to maybe planting 1.5 square meters apart, but we actually plant 3 or 4. But it's how a forest forms. A forest forms by just wherever the seed is. The seeds germinate basically they compete and the strongest survive. And that's what we're trying to mimic here. So we plant very densely to mimic the way nature forms a forest.
Yeah.
And then that's really it. And then basically the only last thing we do is we mulch really, really heavily. We mulch about 6 inches of mulch, which kind of suppresses weeds, feeds the soil, keeps the moisture in. And then we step away, really. And we normally, within about 3 years, it's self-sustaining and maintenance-free. But within those 3 years, we might need to do a little bit of weeding, topping up the mulch, a little bit of watering. But essentially, you kind of step in, do the work, and then step out.
Fantastic. I mean, it sort of sounds like it's kickstarting a natural process.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We're the kind of seed that steps in and sets it off, and then as quickly as possible we back out before we mess it up, really.
Yeah. Don't overthink it.
No, exactly. Don't interfere as well. This is the great problem with humans is we interfere, don't we?
So where are you doing these kind of things? Do you have a lot of projects in the UK?
Yeah, a lot of projects in the UK. We basically, for myself, it was sort of I'm based in the UK. We've just finished quite a big project in London, which I think we kind of touched on before. But that was a hectare we created in London, in Dagenham. There was 32,000 trees that we planted, Miyawaki style, and it was called the Forest of Thanks because it was the borough of Barking and Dagenham wanted to do something to kind of thank key workers and NHS workers, etc., etc. So they wanted to kind of plant this forest, which is great, and they kind of got in contact, chose the Miyawaki Method, which is incredibly great foresight, actually, of a kind of local authority. And we took it on, really. So we created this big forest, this hectare forest in Dagenham. And that was just at the end of last year. And that's kind of like, those are the types of projects we're doing now, really. And then expanding out into other parts of Europe and this type of thing as well, so...
I think this Forest of Thanks project is really fascinating because it's not just about the practical benefits of trees. Obviously, you can plant trees everywhere, and we all love them. But this one also has a kind of emotional aspect to it, which is it's about using this forest as a way of expressing gratitude and as a kind of cultural and social, I don't know, sort of installation in a way. It's really beautiful. It's like a work of art,
It is, and it's amazing. People have this extraordinary connection with nature, this extraordinary connection with trees, and particularly with the pandemic, it's like, you can see kind of people, they've almost got this hunger for nature.
Yeah.
This reconnection, and I find it fascinating because it's almost as if it's something new. People have like rediscovered nature, as if it's an invention. And it's kind of the healing aspects of it and the serenity that it can bring. And it's a very fascinating thing, actually. And that was a big part of the Forest of Thanks. I mean, that's the long-term aim, is to create, as much as perhaps you can in Dagenham, somewhere where people can go and reflect and sit and spend time amongst nature, really.
Yeah, fantastic. There was a research survey done by University College London about people who have been basically stuck at home like all of us during the lockdown, and what are the things that made you comfortable or made you uncomfortable while we were all basically stuck at home. And the number one thing was having access to a green space nearby. Yeah, and the people who didn't have that struggled a lot more than the people who did. And I can totally empathize with that because I live just around the corner from Victoria Park here in East London, and literally go there every day. And I think if I didn't have that, I would be really, really struggling, missing that sort of moment of a bit of peace and feeling of openness as well in a city. Very important.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't think you can ever say, any of us can really ever say that once we've been out in nature, we don't feel better.
Yeah.
You instinctively do. Even the sounds of nature, like bird song or the sound of wind in trees. There's something that just connects you. I don't quite know what it is. It's something very ancient that you just feel better, basically. And we now know, don't we? We now know if you go into a forest, spend even 20 minutes in forest, physically your immune system's boosted.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're amongst the negative ions. You're amongst the chemicals that the trees can secrete that basically actually we absorb through inhalation, and they make us feel better.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. So there's this wonderful thing of going outside, feeling better. And I'm the same. I mean, I live in rural Wiltshire, but even when I go outside, the problems that you've been sat in front of your computer, they become they're put into perspective, I think, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's our natural state, isn't it, to be out in nature. We spent the vast majority of human the human story just in nature, without these sort of artificial structures and artificial materials around us. So this idea that going out in nature makes you feel good, or it does good for you, that's actually how you're supposed to feel all the time. It's just that we have so many constraints on that by living in cities, by working on computers, spending so much time indoors.
Absolutely. I mean, I had this lovely saying that I love, which is that it's not so much the connection with nature that heals us, it's the disconnection that makes us ill.
Right.
And I think that says it all. It's that disconnection that makes us sick. It's not yes, going out into nature heals us. But it's that disconnection that, as you're saying, we've had from time immemorial, that we don't have, or very few of us have, or the people that do, the indigenous people, have, and they're the ones who aren't sick, and have their traditions and their connection to the land and sense of community and family and everything, really.
So I think we can agree that obviously having more trees in cities, and particularly having that sort of density of trees that you could call it a forest, an urban forest, is a really good thing. And for me, as an urban designer, I can think of loads of bits of leftover space and bits of greenery that isn't really used. I think I have a lot of like the post-war estates around where I live. A lot of those have these sort of strips of green space that nobody really uses, and you just start to think of the possibilities. So I guess one question is, what's the limitations of doing a Miyawaki forest? Do you need a plot of a certain size? Do you need certain conditions to make it work?
I think size-wise, we normally say 100 square meters is the minimum.
Oh, okay. It's not that much.
No, it's not really. We do tiny ones. Like I did one today that was 3 square meters.
Okay.
I drove down to Poole and did one that was 3 square meters, which is great because it's 12 saplings. It's kind of, a bit of biodiversity in someone's garden, and it's fantastic. But it is 3 square meters. But we normally say 100 square meters means there's enough space for the biodiversity to flourish and be self-sustaining.
Okay, I see.
So that's and really sort of 2 to 3 meters thick. You need that thickness so that the kind of everything can go on within it without sort of us interfering, really.
Okay. Well, that's a lot to work with, for sure. The 3 meter squared one that you did, was that part of the SUGi Pocket Forest?
Yeah,
initiative?
Absolutely, yeah.
Please tell us about that.
So this is SUGi, which is a setup that I'm part of as well. And it's like a worldwide rewilding organisation. But we set up in the UK this concept of pocket forests. And again, it's just to bring literally 3, 4, 5 square meters of forest into the urban area, so that it's accessible. It's kind of like you never really think I could bring a forest into my back garden or my patio or my yard or something, and that's kind of what we're aiming to do, really. So we create these, use the Miyawaki Method. We plant the same. We do the same research. So we research which trees are going to work, the best indigenous ones. And we then design it and we bring it into all sorts of areas, urban areas, London areas, everywhere really. And it's kind of like, it's kind of fascinating because it's people fall in love with it in a way. You plant their little forest and it's their little forest. They bond with it. And it's kind of so funny, you know, like the one today, like as soon as I put it in, there's like a robin there and everything. And so like kind of people think you've already brought the biodiversity in. And that type of thing. But it's great. And we put sometimes we put like a few kind of wild edible trees in there as well.
Oh,
this
nice.
type of thing. So you get a bit of fruit and some nuts. But it's just, again, it's just that connection that people want. They want the connection with wild and nature, and it's a way of bringing it into any environment and any home or garden.
Yeah, I think probably the sense of ownership as well is quite important.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, people get very caught up on that actually, but it's lovely. I mean, that's what you want. You know, you want, you know, people to feel pride within nature because it strengthens that connection that we have.
Yeah, and you can kind of, as you were saying, the survival rate of the trees is very good with this method.
Yeah, it's normally, so basically I think the kind of figures are 97%, 97
Oh,
to
wow.
98% tree survival rate. And that's on, currently we're on about, I think there's about 3,000 Miyawaki forests around the world, about 40 million trees, 97% survival rate. And that's, you know, ranging from Africa, Australia, India, Europe, the US, everywhere. So it's a fantastic survival rate.
Can adapt it to any climate, any context.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strengths actually, Ross, is that you can adapt it to any environment because you're looking specifically at the trees that would grow in that local area. You can adapt it to anywhere.
Is this like is it why I'm kind of curious about this is because I've been reading that a lot of street trees in London and in cities around the UK are having to be felled in recent years. I think it was read between 2012 and 2017 there was something like 40,000 trees in London had to be removed. And I just wonder why is that the case? I think it's a lot of it is to do with the wrong tree planted in the wrong place with not enough maybe of this care put into the soil and that kind of thing. So I would just love to have more of your the Miyawaki thinking and that sort of approach brought to it, so we could kind of ensure that these trees can, you know, we can get the benefit of it for years to come.
Definitely. I mean, with Miyawaki Method, you know, we bang on about this thing of native indigenous trees, but you know, there's a reason. You know, a native tree. Okay, obviously not across the board because we have problems in the UK with ash and oak and everything that are native. But on the whole, your native trees are adapted to their environment. They're adapted to the biology that's around them, but also the biology adapts to the tree. And that's really what biodiversity is with trees. It's the biology that's adapting all the organisms and wildlife. They adapt to that tree. So when we get this monoplanting, like you're saying, like the London planes are great tree, they look beautiful and they absorb a lot of carbon, but there's no biodiversity. I think they have like one insect or something that lives in a plane.
Really?
Yeah, it's horrendous. Where you're in oak trees, I think it's over 500 types of insects unique to the oak tree that live in that tree. And, you know, there's a good reason for that, because this takes hundreds of thousands of years for insects to adapt to the trees that they live in.
Right, sure.
So it's kind of like this, you know, the monoplanting thing, to me, it's almost like a bit of a risk. You're putting a tree in, and as you said, you know, it's put in, it's slightly neglected. The soil's not that great. And we do get these real problems where if we're planting forest, and forest, you know, is literally just a mix of trees. You know, like normally in the UK, we're planting 20, 25 different species per forest. But it means that if you have an issue with 1, 2, 3, 4 species of tree, well, you've got 20, 21 different types of species that are healthy, so they just fill in. So for me, this is the kind of the key to it, really. And if you combine that with the fact that with the biodiversity and the biodiversity of the soil and the life that's going on within a healthy forest, it kind of controls everything, really. You know, the levels of beneficial versus unbeneficial fungi in the soil, they'll kind of control themselves. And pests, you know, the birds will pick off the worst of the caterpillars and this type of thing. So nature will balance it out, but it kind of needs that environment to be able to do it.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. More resilient. Yeah. When we're talking about biodiversity, I mean, sometimes I think it's hard to imagine what is biodiversity in a city. Cities feel quite sterile. And although we do have foxes roaming around the streets this time of year, it can be sometimes difficult to imagine, like, what's the other kind of life going on in cities that we should be supporting, and that these kind of, you know, trees and forests can help to support.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's the thing is they're like, we call them like green deserts sometimes. Yeah, a lot of urban areas are literally like green deserts. And I often think, you know, biodiversity, there's so many different levels of it, but it's even sound. If you think biodiversity can just equal sound, it can equal bird song, the sound of pollinators and bees, the hum of the bee and everything. That's kind of one side of it. And the other side of it is just, as we say, it's this interaction. You know, a lot of it, yes, you can hear it. A lot of it you won't ever hear or see it.
Okay.
It'll be in the trees, under your feet and everything. But it's this kind of like ecosystem that's just working together. But without the right environment in the urban areas, it's just not going to flourish. So
Okay.
this is kind of, and dense forest is really one of the best, if not the best, but ways of rapidly building biodiversity.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Something I wanted to talk about as well, because I've been following you for a bit on LinkedIn, and you quite often post these like very interesting sort of stories about how trees are being used around the world and how, you know, benefits you can get from trees. And one of the things that I spotted was in Japan, coastal forests are a really key tsunami defense. So can you talk a bit about that, about like trees as a sort of form of disaster resilience, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was actually one of Akira Miyawaki's great things, was actually planting these trees as structures to really protect people. Because in Japan, obviously, they have huge problems with tsunamis, particularly on the East Coast. But what they noticed, and again, it's kind of fascinating, is that when they had the tsunamis, the trees that survived were the indigenous trees. You know, the pine trees, which were the ones that had been, planted as plantations, were just ripped out of the ground and actually caused massive damage. But the ancient varieties, the indigenous trees, the ones that had adapted and got their roots down, they were able to survive the tsunami. And through doing that, it was noticed that they would stop the power, or some of the power, of a tsunami as it came in. And they would also stop through the backwash of the water going out, which is almost where more damage comes, because all the rubbish comes back out. But the trees and the forests would actually act as a filter and stop all the cars and houses and rubbish and everything from being sucked out. So based on that, in Japan, they've been doing huge work on this, is actually planting forests along coasts to try and act as tsunami breaks. And with a Miyawaki method, you can have a forest that's big enough to basically do this in about 20 years. So to 2 decades from now, if you planted now, you could have something that actually could protect, I mean, not 100%, but could offer huge protection from tsunamis. And I think there's one that Akira Miyawaki is involved in at the moment, which is like 300 kilometers of tsunami break at the moment.
Wow.
Which is kind of incredible, really, using the Miyawaki method. So, it does work. And it works because the trees get their roots down. really fast, and that's one of the things of the Miyawaki method. And then they're able to bend. It's almost as simple as that. You know, they can flex, take a huge impact, but not be ripped out of the ground. So
Right.
it's a very clever way, really.
Yeah, about the tsunami, just tsunamis in general, because I was thinking about this and I thought, oh, but of course tsunamis aren't influenced by climate change. And I thought, wait a second. And I Googled this. And actually, there's been research done that suggests that the increased rainfall and the increased ocean water temperature that we are experiencing because of climate change actually has a sort of increasing impact on the number of earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic activity. Yeah. And so something researchers came across was that when there's more rain in Nepal, then there's more frequent earthquakes. And there's also there was also something about sea level rise can, depending on like volcanoes, can actually put added pressure on them, and that can sort of basically squeeze them a bit like a toothpaste tube and like send the lava upwards. So, I mean, we're still discovering all the ways that we're, you know, impacting the planet and you know, these sort of geological forces that are so big and so hard to wrap our head around, we are actually starting to influence them as well. Really, really fascinating and startling. We keep finding new ways to be scared, I find.
Yeah, to basically mess everything up.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is fascinating, though. It's fascinating how everything is so connected. Like you're saying, you know, it's like one action. There's a responsibility, isn't there, within nature? You know, we do one thing and it causes something else. So
yeah,
it's you know, it's like the whole concept of desertification. You know, we take the top layer off soil. Well, the soil then heats up, which basically burns off the evaporation, so it doesn't rain. So it's the same thing. You know,
this is something I wanted to ask you about this idea that trees make it rain and interact with the water cycle. What's that about?
So basically, as you say, trees basically do make it rain.
Okay.
Because there's kind of a couple of reasons as far as I'm aware. The first reason is obviously because they cool down the land temperature. The cooler the land temperature, the more cloud formation you have and the more likely it is to rain. But also evergreen trees release terpenes. So they do what's called cloud seeding. So particularly like, you know, in areas like California and this type of thing, the redwoods cloud seed. So they send up terpenes like essential oils. Wow. And these basically help it rain. They help the moisture levels form in the upper atmosphere. And that causes rain. So there's this amazing cycle. So we take the trees away. We're warming up the soil. We're warming up the atmosphere. We're taking away literally the way that trees can draw down moisture. So,
and it's suggested that this might play a role in the drought in California.
Yes, absolutely. They reckon that basically when the redwood forests on the coast were cut down, which was kind of over the last century or so, that's what's caused the weather that happens now, because the clouds come in or the moisture comes in off the coast. It doesn't condense. It warms up and it evaporates rather than turning into rain. So
incredible.
It's those incredible redwood forests that they cut down.
There's technology that's been developed called cloud seeding, which is I mean, it was famously used at the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, where they wanted to make sure they had blue skies for the opening ceremony. So the day before they basically shot a missile that had some sort of minerals in it. I'm not sure what the chemical cocktail was, but that released and it basically forced the clouds to rain. And that basically, you know, got all the rain out and the clouds basically disappeared. And the next day it was clear. And they've been also experimenting with it in Saudi Arabia as well, because obviously they have such a dry climate. They're trying now to force it to rain to just get a bit more.
Have they had any luck? Or
it's interesting because, I mean, obviously they're probably quite secretive about this kind of stuff, but I was reading that they reckon there was quite a bad flood in Riyadh a few years ago, and they reckon that followed some of their cloud seeding testing. So it's sort of, they probably overshot the mark a little bit and they ended up causing a flood in their major city. But it sounds like we have a natural, we turn to technology for these things, and maybe the answer is just to plant the right trees, plant the native trees that would be there anyway.
Well, exactly. Plant the native trees and cover the soil. As soon as the soil is covered up, the temperature drops massively, and that allows, moisture and evaporation. Sorry, moisture to form, not evaporation. And kind of everything works then. You know what I mean? It's what we take, this constant taking away of vegetation, taking away of trees. It causes the problems.
Yeah, that we didn't foresee. We didn't think far enough.
No, exactly.
And it's one of the big key benefits of trees in cities, especially going forward, is the fact that they cool. They cool the air. Because we're gonna, we're already seeing more heat waves, hotter summers, and that's only going to get worse over the coming decades. So getting in more tree cover, more canopy cover in cities, actually a really, really big resilience step to take. In terms of trying to keep the temperature cool, and it actually saves lives. If you can bring the temperature down a couple of degrees locally, that could mean the difference for vulnerable people.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? When you're talking about a couple of degrees, which kind of sounds nothing, does it? But when it's saving lives, and it's also, it's flood water as well. I mean, not necessarily that's linked to lives, but trees are about the best thing for controlling flood water.
Yeah.
We get these, which we seem to be doing. We seem to be getting, incredibly heavy rain, random heavy rain, like more tropical rain now.
Yeah.
In urban areas. And it comes down and we get these, these problems of runoff. Well, the best thing for processing that is a tree with good soil.
Right.
Literally, it'll deal with it. It'll soak it up like a sponge.
And the tree also slows down the rain as it's coming, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Intercepts it. And that kind of gives you a bit more time for, for the soil and for the sewer system to deal with that water and take it away.
To process it, exactly.
One aspect that I wanted to come back to, you mentioned about how important soil is, and you use that term biodynamics. Can you explain that to me?
That's quite a thing to explain. Biodynamics is kind of like it's one of those. It's explaining the unexplainable, really.
Okay.
It's basically it's a way of it's like beyond organics, really. Put it like that. It's biodynamics stands for biological dynamics. So what you're looking to do is take the kind of life force of soil, plants, etc., and dynamize it. So you're basically injecting the energy into it, and it goes back to, rather than working with the matter, you're working with formative forces. So it's kind of what energy would have formed something like however many millions of years ago, and interacting with that, and it uses a very specific selection of preparations that I won't go into because they're extremely wacky. But they're kind of applied. They're applied to the land and they're applied to plants. And all I know is it basically works. And anybody who's involved in biodynamics knows that it works. I mean, it's been used since Rudolf Steiner came up with it. But I'm not quite sure how it works.
Right.
All I know is it works. And it works by dynamizing the biology in soil and plants. And it's extraordinary. And you can see results relatively quickly. Sorry, that's not a very good answer. But,
no, it's interesting because it sounds quite new agey and quite esoteric. Does it have, is it sort of getting much scientific attention?
It is. I mean, there are scientific studies out there of the microbial content of soil after the preparations. So yeah, I mean, I think the bigger point is that you've had farmers who have had, bare land, failed crops that have used biodynamics, and they've transformed their land within 1 or 2 years. I think that's, the kind of key thing here. And they've transformed it for pence. It's a very inexpensive way of working.
Oh, right.
As well. It's almost like a homeopathic form in a way.
Okay.
You're using tiny amounts, but it's in theory very potent. But the results are out there.
Yeah. I guess it's one of those things that, sometimes you just have to throw your hands up and say, I don't know how this works. Science hasn't explained it, but you can see the results.
No, well, exactly. I was speaking to a man who's a kind of biodynamics master in America, who's been doing it for 60 years.
Okay.
And even he was the same. He said, I couldn't quite tell you how it works.
Wow. Okay.
It just does work. And then he was giving me a lecture on how to make it rain. He said, and this is how, like going back to rain, how you can use biodynamic preparations to make it rain. And he said he had a 90% success rate of being able to create rain.
Wow.
Using biodynamics, which, I mean, I'm not one to question him. It's quite amazing, really.
Well, yeah. Well, it's quite spooky and interesting.
Yeah, it is spooky and interesting, but it works. You can't dismiss it. This is what I love about biodynamics, because there's too many people out there who have transformed their land with it, really. Okay.
Yeah. So how much are we taking this on, the urban forest thing? Because I still feel like it's quite a niche topic. Do you see that growing across the UK?
I think so. I mean, forest's quite a powerful word. Biodiversity is a powerful word as well. So I think more and more it's being taken on. Yeah, it's the problem. The two main problems are legislation. You know what I mean? It's kind of not as easy as just stick a forest in and we're done. And it's space as well.
Yeah.
Obviously the urban area, it's a precious space, land so valuable that it's finding those places that we can actually create forests. And it'd be wonderful. I mean, there are so many, as you mentioned a bit earlier on, there are so many kind of lots and little areas.
Yeah. Leftover spaces.
Yeah, exactly. You just think that's crying out for an urban forest or something. And I think that's where the Miyawaki method's great, because it can come in, it can create the small micro forests, the tiny forests of a couple 100 square meters in that vacant lot or something. But it's hard to find the spaces like that. As I said, it's the legislation is what's kind of holding us back, really.
What's the legislation barrier?
Just so basically, it's either privately owned, it's owned by developers who aren't interested. Like working with local authorities, as I said, Dagenham and Barking and Dagenham have been great, but other ones, it's an absolute minefield trying to get permission and health and safety and everything. So it is hard. It's a lot harder than you would think. You would think people would just
be up
kind
for
of
it.
But it's kind of we're up for it, but we've got sort of 2,500 rules that you have to follow.
It's this business as usual thing, isn't it? It's like, well, it's not something we usually do, so it's going to be a real nightmare.
Yeah, and I think as well, forests, as you said, forest's quite a big word. It's like let's say it's a trendy word, it's a good word. But it's if you think forest, you don't think small, you think slightly wild, out of control. A scary word. Yeah, which is what we need. We need wild and out of control places. Yeah, this is rewilding. So, but yeah, it creates perhaps sometimes a different image than we want.
I have to imagine it is, I've had a bit of experience looking at, costing for public realm improvements. And, if you've got a street or a square and you just want to replace the paving with some nice paving stones, that's like an incredible amount of money. It's so expensive to get this kind of, quite simple, just public realm work done. So I have to imagine there's a real cost argument for bringing in natural, bringing in trees and bringing in, just grass and natural elements, because they're quite cost effective,
Big time, yeah. Particularly if they're self-sustaining,
right?
As well, like if you can imagine putting a little forest in, after 3 years, it costs you nothing,
right?
So even from a planting point of view, like the Miyawaki method's a little bit more expensive. But if you're putting something in that nobody has to maintain after 3 years, it actually almost flips the argument.
Yeah. You have to look at it long term, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it doesn't need replacing. And as you're saying, like paving stones would need replacing every 20, 30 years or something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And then you have to factor in all the societal benefits like improvement to public health, improvements to people's well-being. And, there's all these sort of studies have been done, like people who have a view of a tree outside their hospital window recover quicker than people who have a view of like a more urban scene, like a brick wall. So there's loads of these slightly intangible benefits that you get from it as well that people don't take into account with their decision making because it's not like an immediate return.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I've even heard that people with a photograph of a tree recover quicker. Now that's a bit of a mind boggler, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. No terpenes from that. Sure.
No, absolutely. But it's like, it's always amazed me, and I mean, hopefully it's something we'll see in the future, is with hospitals. Why isn't there more greenery in and around hospitals? It's like, surely that should be the number one thing, green spaces and green views and somewhere you can go and sit in a hospital rather than these kind of blocks of grey concrete that they make you depressed just kind of driving past.
Yeah, it's definitely very, like, the patient experience is very low on the list of operating costs in a hospital, isn't it? Which is a pity because actually it's probably quite a powerful thing.
Hugely so, yeah. Hugely so. I think, as you said, if it aids recovery, it needs to be factored in, really.
Is there any other of your projects you want to plug or any other work you're doing that you want to tell us about before I sort of move on to the final question?
No, I think there's nothing big going on at the moment that would be of any interest, I don't think. So, we're doing, there's maybe one I might mention actually, which is, at the moment we're about to do with SUGi again. We're doing, a project with a school down here in Wiltshire. And that's actually because a lot of the work we do is with schools, which is great. Getting the kids involved, getting the planting, teaching them. We're creating a bee and pollinator friendly forest.
Brilliant.
So they're all trees that basically create nectar, blossom, a food source.
Nice.
About successionally for 7 months. And then the right trees for the bees to hibernate in as well. And so we're creating it with the kids down here. And it's a lovely project, really. I think it's like kind of like, again, it's one of the first of its kind in the UK, actually a pollinator forest, because we kind of think of bees and pollinators more flowers, plants, but actually, they feed on trees and they hibernate in trees. So again, I think it's, long term, it's an interesting one for urban areas. We think maybe a bee and pollinator friendly forests. It could be interesting because it's so lacking in every aspect.
Yes.
The sort of pollinator thing.
That's great, and I love the educational element as well, especially for well, maybe down Wiltshire not so much, but certainly in places like London, the sort of city kids, who maybe don't get that much time in nature. To give them that in their school is great.
Yeah, and it's instinctively in children as well. Do you know what I mean? Even kind of snotty teenage kids, which I have, so I can call them snotty. It's kind of, do you know what I mean? It's still that instinct's in them when they go out in nature.
Yeah.
Get them to plant a tree, it's not very cool, but they still, you can tell they kind of bond with nature. Even if they're the coolest of 14-year-olds.
So I have one final question that I ask all the guests, and I think actually I forgot to warn you about this ahead of time, so sorry about that.
That's probably a good thing.
So this is your totally unprepared, fresh answer here. Okay. Is we're at a pivotal moment in terms of climate change and taking action on climate change over the next coming decades. So from your perspective, what do you think needs to happen or needs to change for us to move on to the right track?
Yeah. Wow, that is quite a question, isn't it? I think the naive, obvious thing to say is we need to stop being so selfish.
Right.
I really do. I think, you know, as a species, we're an incredibly selfish organism, humans. You know, we take and then we give a bit back because it makes ourselves feel a bit better. But it should be the other way around. You know, we should give and then we should take what's left. So
it's a mindset shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a huge mindset shift. I mean, it's very, really interesting actually with, you know, with COVID and the pandemic, that you could look at one of the good sides of it is there is that shift perhaps, or, you know, people considering their actions more, considering actually how much they love nature and they value, you know, the park and being able to get out for half an hour in the park. And thank God the park's there, and thank God that tree's there that I can sit under with my kids and have a picnic. So maybe that shift is the start of a movement, I would hope.
Yeah.
But apart from that, I mean, we've got to stop being so selfish. We've got to stop looking at, you know, nature and Mother Nature as just something that we pillage and take from.
Right.
We've got to think how we can work in harmony a lot more, and look at as we touched on before, you know, the indigenous people, the people who live in harmony with nature, who for centuries we've looked down on. Well, if our supermarkets go down or something happens, you know, they're the people with the real knowledge.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's they're the ones who know how to live in harmony. So I think it's just living in trying to find a way with still, you know, society being the way it is, of living in harmony with nature.
Yeah. I think that's a great answer. Yeah. Totally agree.
Yeah, for me, as you said, it's a mindset. You know, either you stand up and do your bit, or you don't. Really. Yeah. So, and it can be small. You know, this is sorry, Ross.
No, go ahead.
You know, it can be small. Like it doesn't have. You don't have to make monumental change in life.
Right.
I would think you can make a small change. Do you know what I mean? You can grow your own vegetables and give surplus away. Is a great way to start. Or this type of thing. I don't think people should ever feel overwhelmed to do nothing, because I think a lot of us feel that.
Yes, and there is a bit of a problem, I think, in the environmental movement in general, is this idea that you have to go all the way or you're not doing enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Can be quite counterproductive. I suppose we should be encouraging people to do what they can, learn from that, and then do a bit more, you know. Absolutely.
Rather than thinking you've got to go and save the rainforest next month on your own. I mean, it's because people just bury their heads. You know, we all do it. We all bury our heads and we feel overwhelmed by life. So,
is there? Where can people find out more about you online or contact you?
Yeah, well, there's so my business is Wild Urban Spaces, which is online, and also SUGi, which is sugiproject.com, which we touched on as well. So either of those. And I'm always there to answer questions and that type of thing. So I'll be delighted.
Excellent. Well, I'll put all that in my the podcast description so people can click on those links and go find you. And that's about it. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been great fun.
Thank you too. No, the time's flown by actually.
Yeah.
So that was a good sign.